Yes, I am going to use the precious time we have, and there's the presentation, to welcome you all to our session. Before we start, since we are, I'm just trying to find out, I was suggesting a short round to introduce ourselves. I realized that not all members of our learning circle could make it this morning into this round. So we will have to see how far our stock taking exercise can go. But I see there's Ollie, and I see, I saw there was Joan and myself. So we have 3 countries. Our presentation includes 5 countries. I think we should then focus on those countries where we have the experts in this round. I would briefly introduce myself. I am working for the state government of Lower Saxony. I am heading the unit for early childhood education and work in the Ministry of Education. I'm part of the Education Policymakers Network, and I have very much enjoyed exchanging ideas and approaches to breadth of skills with my colleagues. Ollie, would you like to introduce yourself in a few sentences?
Sure. Good morning, everyone from Scotland. My name's Ollie Bray, and I'm one of the strategic directors at Education Scotland, which is the executive agency of Scottish Government responsible for education, and that's from education from 3 to 18 years. And my particular responsibility is around curriculum, digital learning and teaching, and professional learning and leadership.
Right, thanks, Ollie. And I think I've seen João.
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, good morning.
Good morning, everyone. My name is João Costa. I'm from Portugal. I'm Deputy Minister of Education in our government, and I'm in charge of all matters that have to do with curriculum from primary school to lifelong learning. And it's been a real pleasure to participate in this focus group.
Right, there are 2 more members on our learning circle. One is Constanza, who I think will be presenting the reforms she implements in Colombia. She's the Vice Minister of Education there, and I think it's in the middle of the night now in Colombia, and she has a very tight schedule, so I think she could not make it. And we had a colleague from Lebanon, Fadi, who is not in this round either. So I think we will focus then on Scotland, Portugal, and Germany. And since we are 14 people in this round, it would be nice to know who we are talking to, and I hope that we'll be able to open up a discussion later. Can I maybe briefly call everybody to say who you are and where you are from? So I'm calling Ahmed Baghdadi.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ahmed. I work with Qatar Foundation for Education, Science, and Community Development. I'm based in Qatar, but I'm from Egypt. I'm the research manager at one of the entities in the Qatar Foundation, which is the World Innovation Summit for Education, WISE. Happy to be here.
Good morning. Yes, we are happy to. Mercy Nabaira.
Hello, everybody. I'm Mercy Nabiria from the UK, London, and I'm the director of Karma Arts, which works with communities and individuals, organizations to raise profiles of artists, art forms, and also influence policy.
Thank you. I'm Rita Sruti.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Amrita Shruti. I'm from India. I'm a research scholar, a PhD candidate in theatre and performance studies. I'm a dancer and I'm also an educator. I work with educators in upskilling their classroom orientations. I do a specific niche called art integration learning at this school called Shiv Nadar School here in India. And I'm also a curriculum developer and
we look at, yeah,
Okay.
so we look at supporting schools to embrace and sustain learning through play, which would include holistic skills.
Good morning, Patricia.
Hi, good morning. So my name is Patricia Castanheira, and I'm an evidence specialist at Allegro Foundation. I work with Stuart and used to work with Ollie on Playful Schools, and we support and help teachers in schools to embrace and support and sustain learning through play and holistic skills. And I'm delighted to be here. Good morning.
Good morning. My list of participants was sort of closing, opening, and hopping up and down. Have I caught everybody, or is there somebody who had not the chance yet to introduce himself or herself? So please speak up. Well, then that's our group. We are 14 people, and I think we'll just delve into what is breadth of skills and what is global breadth of skills. I'm not sure, is the presentation there, Corinna? Well, I think Ollie.
I can share it if you want.
Yes, is somebody, Joao, if you can share it, then we don't depend on Corinna.
I can do it.
I will briefly introduce what do we mean by breadth of skills. Dominic mentioned a few things, and I hope I am not repeating too much. In the 20th century, education was characterized mainly by content and knowledge accumulation. Well, to put it into a black and white picture, but that was the dominant view on what education should achieve. And literacy and numeracy were the key skills, and nowadays we're realizing that you need to look at a much broader range of skills for learning, work and life, and skills should be seen not only as cognitive but also as social and emotional enablers, providing us with the means to access a multiplicity of mental and physical activities. So as Dominic pointed out in the introduction, the drive for breadth of skills has to be looked at in curricula, but also in pedagogy and assessment. And that's what this network is trying to do. Next slide. The question we have asked ourselves is why we should design and implement breadth of skills curricula. And as I said, literacy, numeracy, and the core or the main skills have been traditionally at the core of school curricula in the 20th century. And nowadays we are realizing that we need to look beyond knowledge accumulation, and breadth of skills seeks to put more emphasis on a broader range of skills to be implemented in early childhood education, but not only. And that's, I think, one of the important findings, also beyond it, also in primary and secondary education, to enable children to become creative, to be able to solve problems, to think critically, and also to have resilience in the face of the many challenges they face. So we found that there is a degree in which breadth of skills approach has been implemented in the countries we looked at. And we also realized that in this network, many countries have accepted breadth of skills as something that needs to be embedded in curricula across the countries. And each country has probably its own way, but it's interesting to look at similarities and also at differences in the approaches. And last but not least, besides embedding breadth of skills into the different curricula, we need to explore how we can teach them and how they can be acquired by students. What is the contribution of the Education Policymakers Network and this learning circle? Salzburg Global has asked members of the Education Policymakers Network, EPN in short, to discuss and further a range of topics in learning circles. And one of them was to look into how widespread or even global a breadth of skills approach is and what competencies have been identified as its core. The members of the learning circle are from Lower Saxony, Germany, Scotland in the United Kingdom, Portugal, Colombia, and Lebanon, as I've said earlier. And we have engaged in a stock-taking exercise, and we have shared and compared the curricula of our respective countries. And we have even gone beyond elementary education and looked into primary and secondary education, because I think it is not only important to implement breadth of skills, but also to have the continuity of promoting these skills from the early stages of the education system until the final stages. And today we are sharing insights and maybe a few preliminary conclusions from the stock-taking effort. And we are also looking forward to the discussion with you as participants of this session this morning. And I would like to ask Ollie to maybe give us a short introduction on implementing breadth of skills in Scotland.
Great, thanks, Monica, and just move on to the next slide if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
And good morning again, everyone. It's lovely to see it's lovely to see everybody in different time zones and also some former colleagues. It's also really nice to see Neil, who I didn't know who was going to be on the call, and I think if I was to be able to fly directly to Neil's house, we'd be about 50 miles away. But actually, there's a big mountain range in between both of us, because I'm in the northeast of Scotland and he's in the northwest. So it would take a little while for me to get there. But it's genuinely nice to see everyone. I want to give you a bit of an introduction this morning to the Scottish curriculum, and I'm going to talk about skills and how skills are part of that. But I also want you to think a little bit about how skills are built into the structure of the curriculum, and then we can maybe talk a little bit about some of the opportunities and challenges for that. So just move on to the next slide. So the Scottish curriculum, or sometimes called the Curriculum for Excellence, it's designed for young people to gain knowledge, skills, and attributes need to thrive for 21st century life. It's not a very different curriculum statement that you would expect to find in many countries, of the world. The interesting thing about this particular curriculum, though, I think, is that it's actually quite old. In fact, the Scottish curriculum as it currently stands was the result of a national debate for education back in 2012. And the first document around our curriculum, or the latest curriculum, was reduced in 2013. Now, if you're an education policymaker, if you work in government, you'll probably be thinking to yourself, well, actually, education cycles, they tend to be about 10, 15, 20 years. So we're about to go, into further kind of curriculum reform. And I think what's interesting about this, and I think one of the things that we maybe bring as Scotland to the Policymakers Network, is that we've been trying to embed skills within our curriculum for almost the last 20 years. And we've been partly successful in that, but we've also learned a lot about that on the way as well. So if we just move on to the next slide. You need to understand a little bit about the Scottish curriculum to understand where skills might fit in. So I guess I should try to explain that the Scottish curriculum is designed to support young people from the ages of 3 all the way to the ages of 18. Education is not compulsory after the age of 16, but most young people in Scotland stay within school or full-time education in terms of the age of 18. And in Scotland, you would be expected to follow a broad general education up to the age of about 15, and then you enter the senior phase, where you can take part in a range of qualifications, and you take part in these qualifications at the ages of 16, 17, and 18. So there's not a leaver certificate as such, it's a portfolio of qualifications that you might take part in. So a broad general education up to the first part of the schooling, primary and the first part of secondary school, and then assessment after that. And the next slide, please. The other thing that we need to understand is probably a little bit about, I guess, the vehicles that we've got in order to deliver the ambition behind the statement. And I'll describe this a little bit about what we believe, in Scotland, what's our values base for the curriculum, the vehicle in order for us to help achieve this belief, and then also in terms of how we get there. And I'm going to talk briefly about these now, but again, I would challenge you to think about, with some of the wording that we use here, how can skills be embedded into this curriculum framework, bearing in mind, of course, this curriculum framework has been about since 2012, 2013. So first of all, then, if we go to the next slide, what we believe. So one of the first pieces of work that was done during this period of curriculum reform was the publication of a document in 2014. Boy, we published a lot of documents when we were developing the curriculum, probably far too many as a result of that. And we've learned a lot, I think, from that as well. But it was really about what do we value. So at the heart of the Scottish curriculum, if you like, there are four values or four aims, and that's to enable all young people to become successful learners, confident individuals, responsible citizens, and effective contributors. And if you think about these four things, you cannot do this with knowledge alone. This has to also include skills and attributes, bearing in mind that that word skills is also in that initial curriculum statement. And the next slide, please. The vehicle to do this is the curriculum. And I think it's really important in Scotland that when we talk about the curriculum, we don't just talk about curriculum areas and subjects. We talk about all four of these things being equally important. So young people in Scotland are entitled to curriculum areas and subjects, and that's purposely in the bottom right-hand side, so it's not what people concentrate on. It's also about opportunities for personal achievement, interdisciplinary learning opportunities, and then ethos and life of the school community as well. And this is pulled together into a portfolio for young people as they move through compulsory education. And if we move on to the next slide, one of the things that we've learned is that it's all very well to be able to sort of develop the curriculum as well, but we need to make sure that teachers and in particular practitioners have got the tools and the knowledge to be able to do this, in particular around curriculum making, because we don't prescribe what should be taught in schools within the broad general education. That's up to the local context and for teachers and head teachers and local leadership teams to decide. So we call this concept curriculum making, and again, there's depth behind all of these things, but we say that it's important that teachers know the big ideas, for example, the knowledge and skills that young people are expected to get, and more on that in a minute. They need to be aware of their own opportunities for professional development and leadership. They need to be part of meaningful learning networks, something that we've really tried to develop over the last 5 or 6 years. They need to be clear on practical approaches. That's pedagogy, something we've not always been good at and trying to get better at. And they need to understand the needs of learners at an individual level, including learners, of course, with additional support needs. And if we just move on to the next slide. I'll talk a little bit about the curriculum, because within the broad general education, we don't have prescribed bits of knowledge that young people are expected to know. We have what we call experiences and outcomes that have to be covered by young people at different ages and stages in the curriculum. And this is an example here from the early years framework. So this isn't talking about measurement or being able to do things. This is a statement that's in the Scottish curriculum. I've experienced the wonder of looking up at the vastness of the sky. I can recognise the sun, the moon, the stars, and link them to the daily patterns of life. So even just by this very statement, which is giving young people an experience, we can start to think about the skills development which is embedded to this, because you cannot do this just by showing young children a picture of the sun or the moon of the sky. And if we move to the next slide, and I'll give you an example from the science curriculum, at the other end, when children are a little bit older, through investigation, I can understand the relationship between current, voltage, and resistance. I can apply this knowledge to solve practical problems. So again, built into the very curriculum framework, it's not about learning about electricity or learning about batteries. It's about giving young people an opportunity for investigation and applying this knowledge to solve practical problems. And of course, to solve the practical problems involves skills development. And the next slide, please. We also in Scotland have what we call a skills framework. This wasn't developed at the start of the curriculum, but this is a national sort of skills framework that's developed by one of our other agencies, Skills Development Scotland, and has been signed up to by Education Scotland and also the Scottish Qualifications Authority. We call it Skills 4.0. If you're familiar with the work from the World Economic Forum, you'll see the links there. But this is important for us in terms of young people being able to develop skills. One of the challenges that we had when we developed these skills is actually helping people understand what we meant by them, and this is a big challenge. It's something that I'll talk about in the other breakout session later. So if you move to the next slide, one of the pieces of work that we're doing at the moment is actually going back and defining what we mean by each of these meta skills, that there's a confident language between the two. And if you move to the next slide, we're also doing a piece of work around backwards mapping, because quite often when we talk about skills development, we either talk about it in the early years of education or in the senior phase, but we forget how young people get from here to here. So we're doing a piece of work around all of these meta skills that have been agreed and trying to think about what would these skills look like, or what would it look like for a young person if they're displaying this skill as they progress through education. And if we're able to do that, then hopefully we'll be able to support young people as much as possible. And if you just move on to the next slide, and I've nearly finished, I think we're probably the most developed in this in terms of creativity. we've been working on the creativity agenda now for over a decade, and I've been involved in various points, you know, throughout my career. And I think we're finally starting to get a stage where we're really starting to be able to embed creativity, you know, into teachers' practice, into teacher training, and into our other kind of learning networks. But one of the key messages to sort of take away, I think, is that this takes a long period. You can't just do this overnight, and you can't just say that young people will suddenly become creative because you've made some changes to the curriculum. And I think if we just move to the next slide, where we've been successful with creativity over this time is that we've tried lots of things, but actually now we've got lots of different ways for teachers and practitioners to get to the same point. There's opportunities to explore resources, to read the research. It's all evidence-based, to join creative learning networks, and we've supported the formation of creative learning networks in different regions. That has been, you know, helped by COVID in some ways, because we've got a lot more online networks than physical networks that we had previously. Opportunities to develop and participate in quality and quality-assured professional development. And teachers have asked for different tools and stimuluses, which is what we've tried to develop. And if we just move to the next slide before I finish up, this is one of the tools that we've developed around creativity that we're just piloting at the moment in a number of schools. And it's around interdisciplinary learning that I mentioned before. You know, it's about skills development, but it's a self-assessment tool that teachers can use with their students, you know, to assess how they're getting on with project-based learning. And again, you can use this to self-assess against the objectives in a particular project, around research, around concepts, around the idea of did you fix the problem or did you fail to fix the problem, around that, the idea of communication and the idea of evaluation. And again, just to give you this holistic, rounded view of how you get on when you're embedding with this. And if we just move to the next slide, please. Just to sort of summarize, really, you know, in different, I should mention that rounded part is also part of a qualification that young people can now take in Scotland, which is around creative thinking, and that would count towards the school's attainment data, you know, as a result of that, and that's quite important for schools adapting skills development. So just in sort of very brief summary, I think we've got some of these parts in Scotland, we've got some of the way to go, but all of these parts, they need to be working together. So you definitely need, you know, defined curriculum policy. There needs to be clear definitions around skills, and that needs to be understood by everybody in the system, including the young people. Otherwise, it's not going to be possible to achieve. You need real practical examples that schools can follow. You need tools for empowerment so that people can take these practical examples and turn them for their local context. You need good ongoing professional learning and leadership, which embraces the skills agenda, and it needs to be, or creativity needs to be included within your accountability framework, so that the schools, are also being accountable for the skills agenda, and not just other measures. And then also we need this kind of clear review cycle. And my very last slide is just an example of the period that we're going through now. Just move to the next slide. And that is, we've just had another review, of the curriculum for excellence sort of 20 years later, and we're about to go into this sort of further period of reform where, again, we'll be building on the knowledge and skills and attributes agenda to sort of try and take this forward. So if you like, the journey continues, but I think there's a lot of interesting learning, from the last 20 years, in particular, the last 10. So that's all I've got to say for now. I look forward to the conversation later.
Thanks a lot, Ollie. João, Fadi is not here, so I think we'll skip the Lebanese slides, move ahead to Germany, and then close with Portugal. Right, so I will give you a short insight into what Germany has done in terms of breadth of skills. I will focus mainly on elementary education, and will also outline that there's a certain break or rupture between the system of elementary education, primary education, and secondary education. Briefly talking a bit about the structure of the system. Elementary education has only recently been acknowledged as the first stage of the German education system. And it's not provided by the state, but by the municipalities. So it's not part of the state education system. And then talking about the state, that in Germany is the national government and the federal state governments. And the provision of early childhood education or elementary education is provided on a municipal level, and is supervised by the 16 federal states, responsible each for their own education policies. and there's no national education policy. The national government has defined the education mission only for early childhood education as part of the national legislation on social welfare. And then each of the federal states decides on the school curricula. So there's a big challenge in defining the transition between what is taught in the primary, in the elementary education, and what is then followed in the school education. And the breadth of skills education in Germany goes back well, until the time when the United States of America became independent, when scholars like Fröbel and Pestalozzi gave rise to the concept of a kindergarten. And the kindergarten and the elementary education was always broad and had a breadth of skills approach. And even if it wasn't at the political agenda, there was a lot going on, and there were also predecessors of other approaches that were then followed up by Montessori and others. But while elementary education in Germany very much follows the breadth of skills approach, school curricula are still very much organized in the different subject areas. And that is why in secondary education, the disciplines of the different academic subjects, they very much influenced teachers' training. So you became a teacher in a different subject and not a teacher overall to educate children once you reach the secondary school level. And since this tradition is very strong and teachers consider themselves not as teachers on the broad scale, but as representatives of certain academic disciplines, there are certain challenges to implementing breadth of skills across the whole range. And I think the best example for breadth of skills in Germany is still elementary education. We have working groups to see how there can be a smooth transition from the approach you have in elementary education to what you have in primary education. There has been a lot happened there, but then between primary and secondary education, you have a bit of a rupture again, because then it becomes very much subject-based teaching. Even though there are first ideas and initiatives to become broader, but it's more adding breadth of skills than embedding it in the different subject areas of school. Right, that is the overall view on the German system in a nutshell. Next slide, please. Right, what I'm talking today now is the curriculum for the federal state of Lower Saxony. The other 16 states have similar curricula, but it's in their remit to make the curricula. So there is no national curriculum, but there are papers to outline the differences and the similarities. And I think in elementary education, it is a very similar approach in all of the 16 federal states. Ollie talked about curriculum making as an important step, and we have the national legislation that maps out what little children should learn, which is very broad in terms of become resilient personalities with emotional, social, and cognitive skills. And we have well detailed and made more concrete what that means for early education providers in Lower Saxony. There's an overall curriculum and then more detailed recommendations for language and communication skills, and also how to go about the education of children aged 0 to 3 years. What I'm presenting now is elementary, as in between roughly 0 and 6 years until children enter primary school. Next slide. The curriculum for elementary education in Lower Saxony puts very much emphasis on the values of a democratic society and sees the early childhood education as like a core of also shaping a society that is based on values of participation, of consensus building. And part of that is also access to all activities and to education in the system as such. There's a strong emphasis on the pedagogy of plurality, where children from very different cultures and family backgrounds come to a daycare center, and they and their families need to be included and supported in giving education to the children. Elementary education in Germany is voluntary, so parents can choose not to. Once primary school starts, it's compulsory. There's a very holistic approach to education shaped by the tradition of the kindergarten. Children learn by gaining experience and knowledge through exploring, experimenting, and analyzing. And they are guided by co-constructive educators, and there are principles such as scaffolding, as in the children is finding his or her way, is exploring with all creativity, and the teacher has not to teach but to provide support and ideas and inputs into a learning process that is basically in the hand of the child. Next slide, please. Of course, you always have to combine skills in these areas with milestones of a child's development in different areas of experience and learning. And we have mapped out the motor skills, health and hygiene, language and communicative skills, life skills, starting early as in how to put my trousers on, to how do I find my way home, as in basically becoming an independent, strong personality. We also have more subject-based skills in the area of basic mathematical understanding, but also aesthetic education, where creativity has a strong role. We have nature and environment, and we have also skills in the area of existential, ethic, and religious questions. Next slide. So the approach is very much teaching and learning in everyday life situations. Play is the basic way of learning, which embeds all the aspects which Ollie also pointed out, creativity, the curiosity to explore, experiencing a learning environment with all your senses, starting with putting the things into your mouth and crawling around, and observing and analyzing is a task which teachers have in order to support child development and learning. So it's less implementing a curriculum, but more following the child's interests and curiosity embedded in an overall curriculum where certain development milestones have to be reached. And the teacher should be a role model for children in terms of being curious, him or herself, in terms of having all the competences that children should acquire in terms of listening, be nice to each other, and a lot of other skills that are linked to how to raise children and to educate them in the early childhood stages. Next slide. Right, so this much for Germany, and when we worked in our learning circle, I was very interested in what João presented, and I realized that in Portugal, as very much also in Scotland, it has been achieved to implement skills which I have described for German elementary education, also in the following stages of the education system. So I think Jean will talk less about elementary education and more what should follow next. Thanks for your contribution, Jean. It's your turn now.
Thank you, Monica, and hi everyone again. So I'll give you a brief overview of what has been happening in Portugal in the last couple of days. And like Monica said, it was very interesting in our learning circle to realize that we are concerned with similar issues, and that I think my contribution, like Monica said, is that we can extend it from elementary school beyond. Also because elementary school and the preschool are very good examples, especially preschool, I would say, are very good examples of what can be a change in the classroom for the years afterwards. I'm not able to move my own slides. Yes. Okay, so we define in Portugal 3 pillars for our education policy And these pillars are success, school achievement, inclusion, and citizenship. Now, these are words that can be found on most curricula around the world, but they can be assigned very different meanings. And so we wanted to ask, what do we mean by success? How can you consider that a student is a successful student? And we wanted to depart from a view in which you just look at his marks and say, well, if he's a 10 out of 10 is an excellent student, if he's a 5 out of 5 or out of 10 is a medium student. And we wanted to know what's behind these marks, what is behind these achievements. Also, we defined, we had a major concern in Portugal, like in many other countries, but in Portugal with more severe gravity. Success is very much, is mostly driven by external causes. So the socioeconomic status of the families is the main predictor of school and their achievement. And so we could not design a very beautiful curriculum if it is not designed for all students. And so inclusion again can have different meanings, and we wanted to intensify the meaning of this word. And we were also very much concerned with, like Monica and Oli mentioned, for Germany and Portugal. We're very much concerned with what do you do with all this knowledge? What do you do with these skills? And how can they be relevant for your interpretation of the world, for the choices you make as a citizen? So I will, in this brief overview, I will go through these 3 pillars and do the job of feeding you with some information about the meaning we assign to each of these words. And this is very bad in terms of color, but I will try to go through this. So the first thing we did was to ask a question, and we'll launch a national debate on this. What are you expected to develop through your 12 years of schooling, but starting with preschool? So actually for the 15 years that you may spend in school in Portugal. So school is compulsory from 1st grade to 12th grade, but we have by now 92% enrollments on preschool from age 3. And so we defined a document we called Student Profile by the end of compulsory schooling, which mainly asks this. So what is a successful student? What is this successful student developed throughout his years of schooling? And this document is organized as a set of values, principles, and core competencies, which you find here. So language and text. So the main idea is a successful student is not just someone with encyclopedic knowledge that you memorize one day, leave in a test or an exam the next day, and on the 3rd day you have forgotten all of this. So we want students that are not only knowledgeable, they have knowledge of scientific and technological knowledge, but they go beyond that. So they are able to interpret different languages, different texts. They are able to communicate effectively. They are able to reason, to solve problems. They do so with autonomy, investing on their personal development, and very importantly, they develop creative thinking, critical thinking. They are concerned with their health, with collective well-being. They are able to cooperate and work with others. And one very important aspect for me is that we elected as one of the core competencies aesthetic and artistic sensitivity, and as an important mean to create more solid and integrated human beings. When we talk about inclusion, And this little image here really shows what has been the past of Portugal in terms of inclusion. So if we go back to the before the years the 20 decade of last century, mostly what happened was if you have some kind of impairment, disability, you were at home. There were no social responses for you. Then in the 50s, last century, we opened the first institutions for special education. So we had a model with first responses to people with to children and youngsters with disabilities, but they were in separate schools. So this was a response, but it was a segregated response. Then from the 90s on, after the Salamanca Declaration, and especially throughout the 90s until 2008, and with a very good law that was passed on 2008, we were able to move these students who were in special schools inside general schools. But this did not mean that they were included, just meant that they were integrated, because in many cases they were in separate rooms inside the schools doing their own things, and the other students were together in classrooms. So what we've done in 2018 was really a shift in paradigm in terms of the concept of inclusion. First thing was we defined that all means all. So if we know that there are several sources of exclusion and barriers to have success in school, we had to make sure that our law on inclusive education targeted all students. So you may be excluded not only because you have some kind of physical or cognitive impairment, but in most cases because of your social economic background. It can be because you are a migrant. It can be because you don't speak the national language. It can be because you have emotional issues that create barriers for you to be an active learner. So what we did was to make sure that not only in terms of law, but also in terms of coherence of all our programs, some long-standing programs like the National Literacy Plan, or a National Plan for Arts, or a program that is from the 30s last century, the school sports program, that they all were redefined in order to target inclusion and to be active responses for a more inclusive school. So this was an important reconfiguration of the goals. And for inclusion to really happen, we introduced tools like the enhancement of flexibility in curriculum design, giving more autonomy to the schools, working on assessment. We cannot have the idea of introducing flexibility and innovative ways to assess is that you cannot include and then pretend that the classrooms are composed of standardized students that have all the same background. So you have to have the freedom to develop curriculum in such a way that you take every student to the limits of its capacity. There's also this idea that one of the goals of inclusion is that we grow together. So sometimes I think that the policy on inclusion is good for the excluded ones, but our assumption is that it's also very good for those who are not excluded and learn in terms of their interpersonal relationship in some of the skills that have been identified in our student profile, and that there's growth for everyone. For this to happen, we also have to undertake a very difficult task, which is to identify a core curriculum. You do not include and you do not develop more ambitious skills if you have very large curricula filled with knowledge, with declarative knowledge and contents. So we work together with the professional societies and scientific societies in order to define this core curriculum. Finally, for the word citizenship, we created a new area in the curriculum for citizenship, and we based it on the Sustainable Development Goals with areas, and this has been very. We have elections next Sunday. And one of the topics elected by some parties was this area in the curriculum, wanting to ban it. And basically it's because there is gender equality and sexual education in the curriculum. So some very conservative sectors of our societies think that this is a scandal that schools address these topics in the curriculum. Now, this is an area that is that is interconnected with all the other subjects, and the idea is that you have information about these topics that you're able to debate, to think, and then when you are grown up, to choose and act accordingly according to your choices. So unlike what some people say here in Portugal, it's not about indoctrination, but it's about dealing with actual information instead of just clicking on some social network where the fake news are growing by the day. So we have a set of legislation that was developed with some principles: the principle of contextualization, adaptability, school autonomy, a major shift in terms of assessment. I have some slides here, but I will not have time to go through them. Stating very clear that the purpose of assessment is to provide better learning, with an action starting at the early years. So let's not wait for the students to fail in order to realize what has gone wrong, but with a big focus on preschool and elementary school. And unlike what our predecessors did, which was basically to say exams are the core of the system, we are stating that learning is at the core of the system. Now, the big challenge we have is the integration of all of this. Sometimes inclusion is the responsibility of some teachers in the school, but then the curriculum is the responsibility of others. And our major challenge for the coming years is to give steps towards the integration of all these measures. As I said, this has consequences for assessment: what we assess, when we assess, how we assess. I will not go through this in detail. I'll be in the afternoon session going through this in detail in the roundtable. But in a way, in a nutshell, our concern is our traditional measures of assessment focus on knowledge only. Now, if you want students who are knowledgeable, but also critical, analytical, reflexive, you cannot assess in only one of these dimensions. We have internal assessment done by the teachers. We have external assessment done by our national exam system. We introduced low stakes exams for the early years, for starting with second grade, so that we have information, and these low stake exams do not return a grade or a mark. They issue detailed reports about student performance, individual detailed reports, qualitative reports, in order to help teachers and schools to develop the strategies that target those areas that are identified as more relevant. Just a final word to mention that all this work was done not only for the general curriculum, but we had a comprehensive method in order to include VET and specialized artistic education. This starts in 10th grade in high school, where students can choose between 3 paths: arts, VET, and what we call the science and humanities curriculum. And this was very important, because when we talk about project-based learning, problem solving, learning, these are all news for VET. These are all news for arts, and so we are learning a lot from these areas that were once kind of neglected in our national curriculum. And the same holds for lifelong learning. So when we talk about adult education, we also learn a lot, because the motivation of adults is different, but sometimes they are like children. And when we talk about flexibility, adaptability, validation of skills, this is also old news for adult education. So this was my brief overview of what we are doing in Portugal. If anyone joins in the afternoon, I'll go deeper into these topics. Thank you, Monica.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. I seize the opportunity. Ollie will be talking about Scotland in more detail following these breakup sessions, and Jean later this evening. So seize your opportunity to discuss these approaches in more detail later. We have a few minutes left, I think 3. So if somebody wants to use the chat to type in your question, we'll try to address them. Given the few minutes we only have left, I would like to summarize for our learning circle that it was striking to see how similar the challenges are that we all face in our respective countries, that there's an overall tendency to look broader than just the traditional skills of calculating and reading, that a complex society as it is emerging in more and more countries, shaped by very diverse opinions, be it very conservative or based on traditional or different cultural values. That is all a very much a challenge we face. And I think breadth of skills, inclusion, and a plurality of approaches linked to a core set of competences that are also social emotional, giving way to coming to terms with each other and looking ahead to learning and creating a society that is based on learning and looking, and rather than a traditional curricula of disciplines. I think the challenge is to merge the two approaches into coherent curricula that are well-based from all angles. And as we have found in our stock-taking exercise, we are on the way, but there's still a lot to be learned from other countries, and a lot of opportunity to think ahead. And we hope that in this network we'll be able to go more steps into what could be a future together. And we are happy to report on our findings and efforts in following conferences. So I see that there's a question: do teachers acquire some special qualifications to help inclusion and successfully implement in the class? Ollie, I know in Germany they do. We have qualification programs for inclusion, and they are for all stages of the education system, from elementary to secondary. But Ollie, Jean, maybe you can add a few sentences.
Well, just quickly, inclusive practice in Scotland is the responsibility of all teachers, and that's embedded into initial teacher training and into the ongoing professional development. But there are also specialist courses and specialist qualifications that some staff may choose to go on, and also access to what we would call centralized resource if you were looking for some specific support around working with a young person that would be shared across schools or a network of schools.
So since this has been implemented in the school as a curriculum whole, as you have described in Poland, so does every teacher need to go through these special qualifications to approach inclusion and have a successful implementation of this in the classroom? Because it might have become very difficult for the teachers itself.
If I can give this, yeah, go ahead, Ollie.
Well, no. So in Scotland, in order to teach within the classroom, teachers have to obviously be qualified, but then they have to meet a section of standards, and these standards are evaluated every year, or self-evaluated every year, and then a professional update is done
sorry, Dominic, I wasn't out before I finished my comment.
No problem, Leila. Thank you for sharing that. Welcome back, everyone, to the main room. I'm sorry for the breakout disruptions at the very beginning of that session. We're not totally sure what happened, some sort of ghost in the Zoom machine, but thank you for bearing with us.